I wanted you to come on and on the show today and talk about this general strike that happened in South Korea last week on October 20th, because I didn't really see a lot of U.S. coverage of this general strike, even though, I think it's like tremendously important. And what I did see, your article was by far the most thorough. So thank you for coming on the show today to talk about it. So I really appreciate that. So let's just start with what happened. On October 20th, at least 500,000 workers in South Korea from all sectors, from transportation to construction to service, participated in a one-day general strike. And from what I've read about this, it seems like these workers are facing a similar crisis as we are in the US, in that more and more people are being forced into the gig economy and facing the lack of labor protections as a result. So just to start off, could you tell us who called the strike in the first place and where did the strike come from?
Yeah, definitely. And thanks again for having me here. It's really exciting to be on your show. I think to start us off, the strike was organized by the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, or KCTU. KCTU has 1.1 million members, and it's South Korea's largest union umbrella organization, which covers workers from a variety of sectors, from healthcare to construction and just about everything in between. This is slightly different than the way unions are organized in the US, but the important piece is that lots of different unions can come together under an umbrella structure, and that's what KCTU is. So last week's one-day general strike was actually part of a larger strike wave that's been building throughout the pandemic. Mass layoffs, corporate bailouts, deteriorating work conditions, have all been pushing workers to fight back. And in South Korea, workers have been hurting for a long time, and from before the pandemic, just like we find here in the United States. And in spite of very difficult odds, which I'll get into later, South Koreans do have a pretty high level of union organization and discipline, and I think that we're seeing that reflected in the struggle that's being undertaken. The general strike is actually just one of a series of actions which will take place around the country in the lead up to the presidential elections in March. KCT organizers are planning to hold other large mobilizations each month, culminating in an all-people's mobilization in January. And to do this, they're building a united front with farmers and with the urban poor in particular. Although I think we can also expect to see that students and people from intermediate classes will be participating as well.
Yeah, very important to point out that this wasn't a one-off event, that it's part of a series of mass demonstrations that are going to continue and culminate with a mass action in January. So would you say, I know that the conditions that sort of impelled the workers in South Korea to strike are very similar to the conditions we have in the US today. Would you say, the labor movement in the U.S. is pretty weak, and it was weakened during the Cold War. Would you say they have a more, they're better organized in South Korea than in the U.S.?
I think it's definitely relative. South Korea and the US are pretty different countries, both in terms of size, population, all these things. I think taking it just as the proportion of workers who are organized and the scale of events that South Korean labor is able to put on, I would say that, comparing those things, it's fair to say that South Korean labor is probably more organized than US labor is at this time. That being said, South Korea is just fundamentally a very different society than the US. So I hope that comes across more as inspiration and less as judgment.
Yeah, yeah. So could you talk a little bit about some of the workers' demands, around the general strike? I know they had a list of 15, I think. So could you talk a little bit about those and, what were some of the economic conditions that drove workers to strike in the first place?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. And I think I'll need to get into a little bit of history, so apologies in advance for a kind of long answer. Um,
No, we love long answers.
Great. South Korea has been dealing with what's called neoliberalism since the 1980s. For anyone who's listening who's not familiar with that term, neoliberalism usually refers to the global economic trend in capitalist countries from about the 70s onward, where capitalist states would dismantle their welfare states, public assets and services would be privatized, labor rights would be contracted, and so-called free market ideology and policies would be promoted across the board. In South Korea, this began under the military dictatorship of Chun and continued after the so-called democratic transition, which took place in the late 80s and the early 90s. The key event to understanding South Korea in its current economic context is the Asian financial crisis in 1997, which was a big turning point in the economy. Before this crisis, South Korea had been posting massive growth rates that were almost entirely built on speculation by foreign investors, mainly from the US, Japan, Europe, that whole camp. And as South Korea experienced capital flight in the wake of the crisis, they found themselves also looking at national bankruptcy. When the government tried to turn to Japanese banks for loans, they were blocked by the US and actually forced to go to the IMF. The IMF, as it does, gave loans that came with strings attached, which are normally called structural adjustment policies. Because of these structural adjustment policies, South Korea had to open up its domestic markets to foreign capital. They had to privatize state-owned assets and offer them on the market to foreign companies. And the South Korean government also used the crisis as cover to roll back basic rights for workers. And that's the background kind of to how we got to where we are today. Now, if we fast forward 25 years and South Korean society is now facing multiple overlapping crises that originate in the organized plunder of its economy during the 97 crisis. Right now, almost half of all workers do not have a full-time contract, which in Korea is called irregular employment. They make about half the pay of full-time employees on average. Sometimes they even work in the same company and often do the same work. They're also often legally excluded from basic labor protections like accident compensation. This is really important because South Korea has, I think, the third highest rate of accidents among the 30 or so countries in the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. I think I got that right. And while South Korea does get a lot of praise for things like having national health insurance, there are still huge disparities in access to basic services. And creeping privatization has meant that this is actually increasingly out of reach for many people. So we have a situation where millions of people are living very precarious lives or just making ends meet. There is a runaway household debt crisis, which is now at 105% of GDP. The average household owes about twice as much as they earn annually. Over 40% of elderly people are living in poverty, and people in their 80s have a suicide rate that's 3 times the national average. Real estate speculation has inflated housing costs and created a housing crisis. Young people are facing incredibly stiff competition in schools, in the job market, and on top of that, dealing with the combined burdens of housing, privatized healthcare, etc. And the cutthroat competition starts early. South Korea is pretty famous for its really high levels of academic pressure. It's actually not uncommon for middle and high school students to basically spend all their waking hours in academics, whether that's school or private tutoring. It's not because they're just nerds. It's because the competition is that fierce, and parents realize that they have to, do whatever it takes to set up their kid. But then that results in this situation where everyone is trying to one up each other, essentially. One 2019 study that surveyed about 9,000 kids from elementary to high school found that 1 in 3 of them had considered suicide because of academic pressure. And it's not uncommon for graduates to spend up to $20,000 on their resumes just to apply for entry-level jobs. And degree inflation is such a big deal that even irregular workers need a college degree to make minimum wage or even less. So that brings us to the strike demands. The strike has 15 pretty complex demands that range from having a 4-day work week to turning 50% of the country's housing stock into public housing. We could sum them up into 3 major categories. The first is to abolish irregular work and extend labor protections to all workers, regardless of their status. The second is to give workers joint decision-making power with management when it comes to economic restructuring decisions. And this is to give workers more power to fight layoffs and also power to shape the economic transitions that are going to come to Korea as a result of things like climate change. And the third category is to nationalize key industries like automobile manufacturing, aviation, shipbuilding, and power generation, and also to expand social services across the board. There's a lot of really great proposals in this third part, like the public housing piece I just mentioned. There's also a demand for the state to hire 1 million care workers to provide free elder care and childcare to everyone. And going back to the stats about youth I shared earlier, one of the key demands is to end university rankings as a way to alleviate academic and job competition. But if we take all these things in sum, the demands are essentially about interrupting and repairing the social devastation that 40 years of neoliberalism have left in South Korea.
Yeah, and thank you for summarizing like these conditions that have compelled workers to strike. And I also imagine that the last year and a half of the COVID pandemic has only worsened these conditions. So, could you talk a little bit about how COVID has affected like these economic conditions and what a year and a half of this has meant for workers in South Korea?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is another area where we can see a lot of parallels with the US because the economic costs of the pandemic are not being primarily shouldered by capital, they're being pushed down onto labor. And so South Korea has historically developed as an export economy that was dependent on the US market. So when the pandemic came, exports were hit very hard, and that sent shockwaves throughout the entire economy. A lot of small to medium enterprises have completely disappeared, and companies of all sizes have gone through pretty big layoffs. In March 2020, 1.6 million workers had to take temporary leave, and the next month in April, almost 500,000 people lost their jobs. The government did put together a $200 billion bailout package, but just like in the US, this was not a people's bailout. This was an investor's bailout. And in many cases, the big companies that received bailout money have ended up being bought out by other companies anyway, or put that money towards things that they don't need to be doing and laying off workers, despite the fact that they're supposed to be, getting this public money to, for the common good, right? Now, there's been a little bit of economic recovery this year, but the impact has still been very hard. It's believed that around 800,000 people left the workforce in 2020, and the majority of them were women who are more likely to be in service sectors that were hit hard by the pandemic. So things are still pretty difficult for most people. People are still dealing with the household debt crisis, the housing crisis, the elder poverty crisis, and everything else that I just named. COVID has not made any of that easier. And while South Korea does get a lot of praise in mainstream media for its efforts to keep the pandemic from killing everyone, which is a pretty low bar, that doesn't mean that there hasn't been a cost to workers. And unlike socialist states like Vietnam or China, South Korea is avoiding measures like full lockdowns because those are bad for business, essentially. And that's resulted in a failure to fully control the pandemic. As in every other case, it's the most socioeconomically vulnerable people who get hit the hardest. In South Korea's case, particularly migrant workers have been some of the ones posting, like really disproportionate rates of COVID infection and death as a result of these kinds of pandemic management strategies.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing up migrant workers, which we'll touch a little bit on a bit later on the show. But before we do that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of labor and resistance in South Korea. Like, for instance, I just found out pretty recently that the trade union you mentioned, which organized this strike, the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, it was organized by Korean industrial workers in 1986 as an alternative to the existing union at the time, the Federation of Korean Trade Unions, which up until the end of military rule was the only union in South Korea and it had been thoroughly infiltrated by the Korean CIA, and it was funded by the AFL-CIO. So it was just another arm through which U.S. foreign policy could exert its influence. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the history of the labor movement and resistance in South Korea, and what history is this general strike a part of?
For sure. You covered a lot of really important points, so thank you for that. And I'll probably circle back to some of those. I think to ground us, I want to start off with the moment that the contemporary labor movement usually traces its origins to, which is the suicide of the labor activist Chun Tae-il in 1970. Chun Tae-il was a 22-year-old worker from a poor family who worked in the Cheonggyecheon district in Seoul in a garment factory. At the time, this was where a lot of South Korea's light industry was housed, particularly textiles. Conditions in these factories were atrocious, mostly women and young girls working anywhere between 12 to 16-hour days, sometimes longer. There was rampant tuberculosis because of poor health conditions. And managers actually had a common practice. This almost sounds like mythical, but they would inject workers with amphetamines to get them to work longer. And this is, yeah,
Wow.
like you tell people that and they have trouble believing you because it just sounds like cartoonishly villainous, but that
Yeah.
was the situation in these factories. So Chun Tae-il was just a 22-year-old worker in these factories. He had not had much formal schooling, but in spite of that, he taught himself South Korea's labor laws, and he actually organized textile workers to fight for his rights, or for their rights, not just his rights. And in the course of struggle of going against the bosses, of going against the government, he found himself being consistently stonewalled. So, in a final act of desperation, he actually set himself on fire in front of these factories, and his words have kind of like become immortalized in the Korean labor movement because he was yelling, "We are not machines. You have to apply the labor laws to all workers." And so that story is something of a founding myth for the labor movement. Now, for anyone who's familiar with Korean history, 1970 might sound kind of late, and it is. And that's not to say that there wasn't a labor movement before then, or that workers don't have a much older history of resistance, because they do. In 1946, for example, workers and the Korean Communist Party organized a 300,000 person general strike against the US military, which directly ruled South Korea at the time. The reason the contemporary labor movement doesn't so much look to these older struggles is because, for one, anti-communism is still the law of the land in South Korea, and I mean that literally. There is a law still on the books from before the Korean War, which is called the National Security Law, which basically bans any kind of socialist politics. And secondly, the contemporary movement's connections to past struggles are not as robust as you might initially think, because a lot of those potential links were broken by violence. In other words, it's because a lot of the socialists, anarchists, trade unionists in the South were either killed or went north in the 40s and 50s. So before the war, during hostilities, and after the armistice, South Koreans faced a really vicious level of repression. And we see that reflected in the South Korean labor movement today. There are two large umbrella union organizations. The first and the largest is the KCTU. And then there's the FKTU, which you just mentioned, the Federation of Korean Trade Unions. The FKTU was founded in 1960, and from 1961 onwards, it was basically an organ of the Park Chung-hee military dictatorship. Now, on the flip side of that, we have the KCTU, which, as you mentioned, first began being organized in the 80s. And this was really because workers recognized that there was a vacuum in real organization that needed to be filled. And so a lot of the non-registered and illegal unions that started to form during the 70s initially came together in the 80s, really steeled themselves in the struggle for democratization and played a very huge role in that. And after the formal transition to democracy, KCTU was able to openly declare itself formed in 1995. But in spite of that, it was actually still considered an illegal entity until 1999. And its recognition was a huge victory for the South Korean labor movement, and it's also a reflection of the fact that KCT was able to build power, and they were able to force that to happen. It's not just that the South Korean government was feeling generous in 1999. They were like, new century, new me. They just kind of decided, it's because they had no choice, essentially. So since its founding and recognition, KCTU has played an increasingly important role in South Korean politics. In the 90s, they fought back against President Kim Jong-sam, who attempted to roll back labor laws. And in that struggle, they actually got the FKTU leadership to join them in a 3-week strike that was estimated to stop about $3.5 billion worth of production. They were also at the forefront of the resistance by farmers and workers against the 2007 US-Korea Free Trade Agreement, which opened up South Korea to a flood of US imports and also gave US corporations the power to contest South Korean laws that they find unfavorable. And finally, KCTU was also a big player in the 2017 candlelight protests that ousted the former President Park Geun-hye, who happens to be the daughter of the military dictator Park Chung-hee. And during that struggle, KCTU again organized a general strike that lasted for a month, and that was instrumental to driving Park out of office. So since then, KCTU has only grown, and I think that's something to really be celebrated. Like I said earlier, the national security law is still on the books, and in that kind of environment, an organization like KCTU is very important because it represents the agenda and the power of millions of workers. I think that a speech that was given at the strike rally last week by Kim Yong-gun, an irregular worker in the power generation industry, encapsulates quite well the importance of KCTU's organizing. Quote, "We are not here to remain victims of our society, but to become the agents of change in our lives." The South Korean labor movement has really come a long way, and what makes this particular strike exciting is that this is the first time KCTU is putting forward demands for social reform that go beyond improved working conditions for their members. In my opinion, that's an outcome of rising worker militancy and organization, and the workers are wielding the strike as a political weapon to change the whole society, which is a very important step.